Welcome back. So this is our first official video of lecture. So this will be the fairly standard way that I'm going to do class, as you've seen in the Canvas page or module for week 1. It's a number of pages. One of those contains the lecture notes. So that's a PDF, kind of goes through. It's got the basic rough outline for the content that week. It's broken down into various learning objectives, and then I have short videos that kind of walk through each particular learning objective. Now, I've done it that way because, as you'll see when we get into homework assignments, etc., problems are associated with a particular learning objective, and this gives you the opportunity to go back and rewatch specific content to whatever skill or objective it is that you're trying to learn better in order to work on material for the class. So that's the basic idea, basic structure, and we're going to keep going in this way. So with that said, if I can move the pages here, what are our learning objectives for this week? So this is just a very short introduction to macroeconomics. In week 1, we're not going to hit anything too hard or too complicated, just to kind of get the ball rolling and get you used to the structure of the class. So our first learning objective that we're going to work on is to really understand what is macroeconomics, or be able to define macroeconomics and explain to someone what is the difference between micro and macroeconomics. Then learning objective 2, we're going to get into a little bit of technical aspects, looking at how we can calculate growth rates using a log transformation, and we'll see what that is. Learning objective 3 is just to explain a few key features of what's happened in the United States economy over the past several years, or sorry, not past several years, really past 100 years. Then we'll talk a bit about, in learning objective 4, why models are useful in macroeconomics. And then we'll have learning objective 5 is for you to be able to discuss why our particular approach, which is what we call a micro-founded approach, is useful in constructing models in macroeconomics. Okay, so let's start with the very first learning objective. What is macroeconomics? So there's a lot of issues that you're going to see in the news currently. We have all sorts of talk about inflation. Inflation is high, 8 to 10% over the past year. So what's causing this high inflation? That's a question of macroeconomics, a question we're going to tackle in this class. What should we do about that inflation? That's another important question. So you may have heard about the Federal Reserve. Of course, politicians and the governments are talking about what they're doing to fight inflation, or accusing other people of causing inflation, and your plan will cause more inflation, and we need to do this to change it. So we're going to learn all about that. And what is it that really causes inflation? What are the policy levers available to potentially rein in inflation, and what policy levers potentially cause inflation? So then there's also a lot of talk about, is the economy in a recession? Is it going to dip into a recession? We'll understand what exactly a recession is. We're going to learn a lot about business cycles, what potentially causes them, and again, policy options to help us get out of a business cycle. So that's what we'll talk about. What should the government do if we do go into a recession? You have policies, tax cuts. How do those things affect the U.S. economy? Right. So these are just some big questions, motivation, things you've seen in the news over the past several years that hopefully you find interesting and engaging in what we're going to try to tackle in this class. Okay. So on to our core question here, the learning objective, which is, what is macroeconomics? Okay, so macroeconomics is really, what I call the study of aggregates. Right, that is the aggregate outcome or the outcomes of the aggregate actions of individual economic actors, right? So we're all out there in the economy doing things, and the macroeconomist is going to look at the sum of all of those actions, right? So we're going to study aggregates. We're going to look at things like total production, which, as you'll see, we call GDP, gross domestic product. We'll look at employment, unemployment, etc. Inflation. All that good stuff is what we cover in macroeconomics. Now, how is that different than microeconomics? What is microeconomics? Well, microeconomics is the study of individual decisions. Right? So, as opposed to in macro where we study inflation, which is sort of all prices going up or changing, in microeconomics, you might study how does Quick Trip set the price of gasoline. Right? That's a microeconomics question because we're looking at an individual decision maker, in this case, Quick Trip, or how do I decide how many hours to work? How do I decide what goods to buy, etc.? Those are questions of microeconomics. In this class, we're going to be talking about the aggregate outcomes of all those individual decisions. All right, so what does macroeconomics focus on? There's really two parts here. So the first part is economic growth, which is the long run, right? Over long periods of time, does the economy grow? So we'll take a look at some data here in a minute that shows how the U.S. economy has evolved since 1900. So the economy on average has grown. We call that economic growth. So we're looking at a long horizon. And that's one focus of macroeconomics, right? What causes economies to grow? What causes economies to not grow, right? So if you look at the United States, since 1900, our standard of living has increased significantly. Compare that to Zimbabwe, their standard of living has not changed at all. Average person in Zimbabwe makes income of about $800 per year equivalent. And it's stayed that way since 1900. So that's a very low standard of living, no economic growth. What causes that? That's the one main focus of macroeconomics. The other main focus is what we call business cycles. These are the ups and downs over the short run. Right, so over the past several years, our economy has fluctuated a bit. Production has gone up and down. And business cycles are the study of those ups and downs over shorter periods of time. And so that's the second main focus of macroeconomics. In this class, we're going to focus a bit more on the business cycles. We'll touch a little bit on economic growth, but not quite in as much detail. We have another course in the Econ major that focuses more on economic growth. So that really is our first main learning objective right there. Okay, so what is macroeconomics? Study of aggregates. We talked down and broke down a little bit of differences between micro and macro, and we've looked at the main focuses of macroeconomics, economic growth and business cycles. All right, so we'll kind of come back and touch on those things when we look at some data in the next learning.